Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, everybody, depending where you're tuning in from around the world. This is the PAVE UK webinar on putting users at the heart of chem design. I'm David Wong, Head of Technology and Innovation at the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. SMMT is the UK's automotive industry body, representing the sum total of the industry, including self-driving technology developers and manufacturers. And I shall be your moderator this afternoon, acting on behalf of PAVE UK, whose advisory board I sit on. But joining us today to explore the importance of understanding the users, and we say users in a broad sense, we'll unpack this term a little bit more in this webinar, but understanding the importance of users in developing CAM technologies. Joining us will be two esteemed panelists, Camilla Fowler, Director of Safety Assurance at OGSA, and Dr. Genovefa Kefalidou, Lecturer in Human-Computer Interaction at the University of Leicester. Perhaps before I ask Camilla and Genovefa to introduce themselves, let me just set the scene a little bit and just to perhaps manage expectations, particularly if you're coming into this webinar with some understanding of CAM technology. So of course, we're talking about connected and automated mobility, first and foremost. But today we are exploring the uses of the technology. And as we will expound a little bit on what users actually mean, we will actually approach the subject from a design perspective, and that is way before the technology is put on the roads, as well as after the technology is on the road. How do we approach the user centricity of services, and as well as evaluation of how these services have actually served the users. But what I will do after I've asked Camilla and Genovefa to introduce themselves will be to set the scene on some of the potential applications of CAM technology, and then we'll dive into some of the more important aspects of user-centric CAM design. Let's start with you, Camilla. Can you just give us a brief introduction to yourself and OGSA?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. So as David said, I'm the Director of Safety Assurance at OGSA. Safety assurance really is about providing confidence, and that may be confidence to OGSA itself. It may be our end users, which, as David says, we're going to unpick a little bit in this session, but also to our customers, to regulators, to members of the public. So OGSA is a software developer for self-driving technology, and we're deploying our technology into a variety of different types of vehicle, and within different jurisdictions, both within the UK, in Europe, and in the US, and for multiple different purposes, both in public road domains and also in off-highway domains. My background is in risk management and also road safety. And, you know, overall, I'd say autonomous vehicles are super exciting. They're, you know, an amazing technology that, you know, I'm obviously passionate about. But what I'm really, really keen on is that the autonomous vehicles meet the projected benefits and they add real value to society. So we go beyond that. What an exciting piece of kit. Let's bring the future here today.
Thank you, Camilla. Absolutely. On your last point there, it's not technology for the sake of technology, but technology serving some societal needs. Genovefa.
Yeah, thank you very much. As David has already said, I'm a lecturer in human-computer interaction within the University of Leicester, and I come from a very multidisciplinary background that involves computer science, systems engineering, human factors, and psychology. And that multidisciplinarity has given me the opportunity to view problem spaces, design spaces, if we want to call it like that, as well, from a quite different viewpoint, combining different fields and methodologies as well, in trying to design technologies that they are efficient, effective, but also they demonstrate and they trigger high pleasurability to the users. And as part of this journey, my journey of investigation, of research, I had the great pleasure to be part of projects like, for example, the UKRI in trustworthy autonomous systems. So I've been involved into working with the hub, but also I've been the co-I for the verifiability node of this stream of research. And within this type of research, one of the key focus areas was obviously self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles. And within that stream, I've been particularly focusing on the user experience aspects, how in effect we can design automated technologies like self-driving cars by understanding the user experience of the potential users, and by doing so, build this kind of knowledge base for understanding what would be the technology acceptance, such technology acceptance by the public, both short-term and long-term.
Well, thank you, Genovefa. So I think what I would propose that we do now is to dive straight into some of the issues that we should explore in this webinar. And then along the way, perhaps we'll bring the audience in and answer a few of the questions that may pop up from time to time. So for the audience, please do type in the questions that you wish to ask. And as we go along, we'll pick some of these burning questions to discuss. So before that, let me just very quickly set the scene. And for those who may not necessarily have followed the terminology in the UK very closely, it's just to clarify that when we say self-driving vehicles, automated vehicles, or autonomous vehicles, we do mean the same thing. It's just that the government preferred term in the UK is self-driving vehicles. In legislation and international technical regulation, you will see the term automated vehicles. And I suppose in everyday language, perhaps also in the pubs, some people may use the term autonomous vehicles. But basically, we're talking about the same thing. So we are using the terms interchangeably. Connected and automated mobility is a slightly higher level term that we use to refer to vehicles that have got self-driving technology, but are also connected in some ways to external communication networks, as well as to other objects, which may include infrastructure and other vehicles that may be packaged in a way to deliver some services, some of which we'll be discussing. And these could be passenger services, this could be logistics services, or perhaps some industrial applications. So that's the first thing I wanted to clarify. And the second thing is just to set the scene in terms of some of the potential applications that we'll be talking about and diving into, and just to explore how it may impact on different types of users. So when we talk about connected and automated mobility at a very high level, I'd suggest that we could perhaps approach the subject from the perspective of three applications. The first one would be personal private passenger cars fitted with some self-driving features. And of course, you may be wondering what self-driving features these are. At the moment, the only self-driving feature that is available, that is approved internationally under UN Regulation 157, is the automated lane keeping system, available in some passenger cars in Germany, Nevada, and California. In the future, there may be another feature, perhaps called automated valet parking. But these are personal passenger cars that you and I can buy or lease or rent. That's one application. The second application is automated passenger services, regardless of whether these are taxis, robo-taxis, other forms of ride hire, including ride pooling, or buses, coaches, or shuttles. Regardless of the form factor as well, there's one thing in common: they carry passengers. And quite likely in the future, these may be used in UK parlance without a user in charge, meaning without a human behind the wheel. So that's the second application. The third application, also intended to be used mostly without a user in charge, without a human behind the wheel, although not exclusively the case, is automated logistics, delivery, or industrial vehicles. So these may be, for example, trucks plying the motorway or carrying goods, or perhaps last mile delivery, or perhaps some industrial applications in farms, quarries, mines, ports, airports, and other places that are considered off-highway. So you can see there are different use cases, different varieties, but broadly speaking, 3 main applications. Now, the reason I set the scene this way is to enable us to dive into this discussion with our panelists on some of the implications when it comes to considering the user or putting the user at the very heart of CAM technology design. Now, perhaps I'll start by posing this question to Camilla. Now, we know that OXA deploys into quite a range of different use cases, probably across at least 2 or if not all 3 applications. So how should we think differently about the users as passengers and users as commercial customers?
Yeah, that's right. So we have passenger shuttles where we're deploying in Florida, which you've probably seen in the press, with Beep as a fleet operator. Now, in that instance, our end user or our customer is Beep, but we also need to be thinking about the passengers and the people who will be using the shuttle and making sure they trust the technology, that they're getting the value that they want, they have a reliable journey. So there's that level of assurance that is needed for that group of users. But also when we look at industrial applications, so it may be asset monitoring, or it may be instances where you have a higher risk environment where you want to take the human out of that environment. Our customer at that point is also the end user. And it goes beyond sort of trust of the technology and safety and security and all of those things that remain important. But you also have, well, does this deliver value for my business? Does this improve the efficiency of my production and my business and the service that I'm providing? Can it interact with other vehicles that we have in the area or other machinery in the area? Can the workers interact with it? Do the safety processes and the procedures that we need to implement that particular piece of technology fit in with the procedures that we currently have in place? For instance, you wouldn't be able to have an operating design domain that said no pedestrians if you're actually deploying into an airport. You need to ensure that it's actually fit for purpose and you meet the needs of that end user, whether that's a passenger, whether that is another worker, whether it's a customer, and that you sort of maximize the value that you're creating through that deployment.
Can I just perhaps zoom in on one of the types of deployment that you mentioned just now, but particularly your current shuttle deployment with Beep in Florida and California, right? So this particular use case obviously is passenger shuttle. In designing to cater for the needs of the end users, in this case, basically the passengers who are paying to ride on your shuttles, to what extent do you design around the needs of the customers or the end users in this case, along with Beep, the operator, who perhaps because of the fact that they're operating the service may know the customers better than the technology developer itself?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the deployments that have been originally in the press, you probably saw the Ollie vehicles, and they were vehicles that we inherited. They look kind of new age, and they were the vehicles that Beep had. So we enabled Beep to operate those vehicles by adding OXA driver as the self-driving technology. So in that instance, it was an existing vehicle that we were then able to add our software to create a solution for Beep. Where we have our e-transits, which you may have more recently seen, which are converted into a minibus, we then are able to think about, well, what is actually needed? So if we're doing a shuttling system that is from, a car park to a terminal, or maybe it is, short distances where you've got a small number of passengers, the e-transit with a minimal number of seats is actually ideal. You can have more vehicles carrying passengers more frequently, and you can meet the needs of that particular user. I mean, I think we've probably all been in airports where we have waited and waited and waited in our car park, waiting to get to the terminal. But actually, if you have a smaller vehicle that runs more frequently, then you meet the need of the end user in that instance. So yeah, I mean, it's about working with our customers, and the beauty of Oxa Driver is that it can be deployed in any vehicle. So where you have a use case and you have a vehicle, or you have a use case and you have a particular application, we can then use our technology within any vehicle platform to meet the need of that particular deployment.
Do you still keep to your tagline of universal autonomy?
Yes, that is still our tagline. And universal autonomy is, you know, this amazing ambition, you know, any place, anytime, any vehicle, any application, you know, and that's a wonderful ambition to have. Right now, where can we add value? Right here, right now, in what application? And that's where our focus is. So that, you know, we're not trying to solve all problems across the world right now. This is about where can we add value, given the maturity of the tech and given the position of society right now.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, Camilla. Now I'm going to turn to Genovefa. Hearing what Camilla just said, and particularly those different types of users, and perhaps throwing in an additional perspective, and that's the users that are typically those falling into the first bucket I mentioned just now, i.e. drivers or perhaps owners of personal passenger cars fitted with self-driving system. So taking all this in mind, holding them in your mind, can I ask you, what approaches can we take to design well for all these user needs? Obviously, it will be very varied and it will be different user needs. But if you could tell us perhaps some of the key approaches, I think that would be very valuable.
Yeah. May I be allowed to make a small distinction here, following up on what Camilla has been saying about the automation as well, and the infrastructure and the service point of view, which is also associated to your question. Now, when we view the users from within the context of direct end users, when they're interacting with autonomous system, is a different use case from when we view the users as interacting with an automated service. And this is something that I highlight very much to my students when we talk about designing systems versus designing services. There are similar methodologies that we tackle in order to design well for user needs, both for system design, but also for service design. But when we are dealing with automated services, we need to keep in mind that the users have to give something to that service in order to be able to sustain successfully the use of that service. And usually what the users needs to be giving to the service is some type of data. This is not necessarily in the same form that is happening when we have users interacting with automated systems. So that's something I wanted to clarify before embarking in more detail to talk about the approaches that we need to take in order to design for user needs. Now, the key approaches and the key principles, let's say, for designing well for user needs when we talk about systems or services is to employ a user-centered design approach. Or else, also, we employ what we call design thinking. Now, the core principles of user-centered design and design thinking is that we we interact with the end users directly at the very early stages of the design process. The reason why this is important is so that we are able to first understand our users more successfully, understand their needs at the early stage before we move on into later stages in the design and implementation. But also, the other great value of employing this approach is that we help ourselves to benchmark. And this is absolutely critical when we design for users, because if we are going back to the aspect of universality, we also observe within our studies all these years that each one of the users are individuals. They have quite a lot of different needs. They have different benchmarking behaviors when they're interacting with systems and services. And we really need to capture this benchmarking as early as possible so that we can later on, when we evaluate the technologies that we have developed, we are able to compare against with the initial benchmarking we have, and therefore have a more verifiable, a confirmed, let's say, understanding of the user experience and utility, perceived utility that the users have when they're interacting with these systems. So that would be my first part of in answering the approaches that we take. Now, within the context of a user-centered design and design thinking approach, we have a number of different methodologies, explicit methodologies, that we mobilize in order to capture user needs. And these methodologies, each one of them, as you may imagine, ranging from interviews, surveys, and so on. There are so many different methodologies that we employ. They all have their own advantages and disadvantages. For that reason, when we are designing for complex systems, including automated systems and services, we tend to go for a mixed methods approach. So we combine different types of methodologies to ensure that we capitalize, in effect, the advantages that different methodologies have, so that we can get a more holistic, more complementary approach of what the users feel and need at a given time. And lastly, I would like to highlight that as part of these user-centric and design thinking approaches, the other core element is the iteration. So we capture user needs in an iterative manner, not just at the beginning and not just at the end of the life cycle of a technology development, but continuously in an iterative manner, so that we can capture the dynamic environment, dynamic changes, if we may say, that exist within the user experience and the perceived utility and safety that people feel, experience, express during their interactions with these technologies. So iteration is absolutely key as well.
I'll pick up on one thing you mentioned just now, benchmarking. Now, if I approach this thing about user-centric design and bringing in the idea of benchmarking, but asking you from a perhaps slightly layman's perspective, I'd say benchmarking is important, but when you benchmark, say, a robotaxi, automated ride-hailing service, what comes to mind in terms of a good benchmark against which you would perhaps assess automated passenger service?
So good, but that's a very, very interesting question. And I think it is a question that it will be relevant to us for many years, really. Benchmarking is quite a big thing because it has a lot of complexity, let's say, even more so when we are dealing with users benchmarking, because of the reasons that I've mentioned just before, which is the fact that each one of the users, even though we are all human, we have quite different behavior. We have different benchmarking, even, in the anatomy that we have in terms of physiological measurements, the way that we sense information around us, it has a lot of variation. So we have different benchmarking, individual benchmarking. And on top of that kind of complexity, we also have the complexity of the ecosystem. So the prior experiences that we have been having when we have been interacting with technologies more broadly and with automated technologies more explicitly. So the complexity of the ecosystem and the use cases let's say, that each one of us is exposed at a given moment, plus the individual benchmarking of our own behavior psychophysioanatomically, it creates a supra, I don't know how to call it. It's a very, very highly complex ecosystem. And the benchmarking aspect, again, it has to be approached in terms of measurement from a multi-point of view, not just a single type of benchmarking, because the single type of benchmarking will not give us a truly representative benchmarking of the individual user. And just to add on that complexity, if we include the social aspect, where in effect we have multiple users interacting at a given moment with an automated system or service, then obviously that increases even more the complexity of the ecosystem, because we have to consider benchmarking not just as an individual for the individual passenger, let's say, or driver, but we need to take into account the benchmarking of the other agents, let's say, that they are taking part at that given moment along driver that is the focus of our investigation. So benchmarking is a multi-factorial and very, very complex aspect that needs to be tackled through multiple metrics at a given time.
So measurement and multidimensional benchmarking, let's hold these two subjects in our minds. I'll come back to you, Genovefa, in a minute to explore a little bit more about these two subjects. But before that, let me just turn to Camilla, because we were talking just now about it's definitely not technology for the sake of technology, but technology to serve some societal needs. And speaking of serving the needs of customers, needs of users, I can't help but think what I learned all those years, probably donkeys years ago in business school, but I assume everyone who went to business school was exposed to the great Jack Welch, once upon a time, the chief executive of General Electric, who said that the key to successful marketing is to ensure your offerings, whether it's a product or a service, serves the needs of customers, and serves the needs of customers so well, such that it makes selling superfluous. You don't need much effort in selling because your product or your service meets the needs of customers so well. Now, bringing that back to user needs, and we like to talk about perhaps delivering value to the customer or to the user. I think we agree that basically automation is only useful if it truly adds value to the user, whoever the user actually is. So from your perspective, Camilla, from OXA's perspective, how important is it that we understand the value that we are adding to our customer, whoever that user may be, and how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it is absolutely critical. I mean, as any business, whether it is, deploying in public road or off highway, if this is going to be making them a loss and doesn't fit in with their business needs, it's a non-starter. And you can take off-highway applications, for instance. So if you take something like asset monitoring, where maybe you're using an automated machine or an automated vehicle to monitor particular assets. We're currently working with BP, looking at solar panels in solar farms, which, some of these solar farms are absolutely huge, the size of a small country. But you can use the automated vehicle to monitor these solar panels and keep, sort of business operations going forward for BP without needing a human there. But in that instance, we don't need technology that can comply with road rules, that can negotiate roundabouts, detect traffic lights. We don't need particular passenger comfort because we haven't got a passenger in there. What we need is something that is reliable and does what we need it to do. So actually, you can drive the cost of that technology right down for the customer and increase the value that you're adding to their business by having much more simple technology, lower speeds, more simple vehicle platform, because you don't need it to be doing all of the things that you would need in a public road deployment. So things like crashworthiness, accessibility for disabled passengers, you know, alignment with lighting regulations and all of the different road rules, which, you know, is a highly complex thing, not only to comply with, but also demonstrate that you're compliant with. All of that just simplifies things and drives the cost down for our customers. And I think that is about adding the value. You know, if you're deploying for technology's sake, we could deploy something that is absolutely, you know, high tech, does everything that it needs to do, and 90% of those features would be not used in the environment that we're using them in. So it's things like that, listening to what the domain is, how fast does it need to go, what's the actual intention of this piece of kit, and how can we deliver that for our customers at the lowest price.
Excellent. So we're halfway through the hour. So I think this feels like a good time to bring our audience in and just see if there are any questions there that we could perhaps explore and discuss at this point before we carry on with our conversation. Actually, there's one. While we're still with you, Camilla, let's pose this question to you from Maddie Halliwell. Do you have a program of user studies to support the ambition for universality, beg your pardon, as much as that is possible? And if so, what are some of your main thoughts, your main insights?
Do we have what, sorry, users?
User studies to support the ambition for universality. I don't know why I can't mention that word today. Universality.
Yeah, okay. So we haven't intentionally done sort of user studies, but we use the information that is already out there. And there's been an awful lot of sort of user insights across, particularly across the UK. The CCAV recently did the Insights project, which was about user experience and what is it that people want to see and all that kind of stuff. So in terms of like public road, sort of what is it that people want, I think we have a reasonably good understanding of what members of the public want. And interestingly, I don't think it is robo-taxis or private passenger vehicles. But yeah, I think for sort of public road deployments, we're working with local authorities and different providers to understand, you know, what is going to make their business more efficient. For those off-highway applications, it's about who is willing to take that first step. You know, who's willing to be that you know, the person who's diving in head first really into new technology, can see the benefit, is willing to invest in it, in an emerging technology, and take that plunge really. So I mean, BP is a really good example where they are investors in Oxa. They're also our customers. They've got an ideal use case which can add value to their business. So it feels like a very obvious sort of use case to explore further. You can also look at things like the HSE website, where, you know, they highlight particular high risk sort of industries where there is a disproportionate number of fatalities as a result of workplace transport. And you can focus in on those areas and think, well, actually, how can we solve that? How can we add value into that industry by automating certain processes or being able to take the human out of that higher risk environment? So, you know, there's work going on in the background to understand those areas. But at the moment, a lot of it is about customers coming to us and saying, you know, can you solve this problem for us? Or we'd be interested in exploring the use of the technology in this way.
It's co-creating the solutions with partners.
That's
and,
right,
and
yeah.
potential customers. Okay. Let's go to another question. It's a very long question from Cormac Mackay. But rather than reading the entire question, I think the gist of it is about mobility as a service rather than private car ownership. I guess we all accept the statistic that most private cars spend about 94 to 96% of the time, depending on which statistics you quote, sitting idle, parked somewhere. So this question basically asks, let me pick it out actually. Where is the full stop here? Okay. So this is where the questions begins. Should the government really offer shared mobility vouchers, car scrappage scheme to promote and support it, presumably in the context of robotaxis, so self-driving shuttles on demand basis, a type of ride-hailing vehicles? I don't think this is directed to any specific panelists. So might either of you have some thoughts? Should government really offer shared mobility vouchers, car scrappage scheme to promote and support these on-demand services?
I mean, my feeling is that, you know, sorry, we've had a huge amount of investment from government, and we've invested, government has invested, businesses have invested in the development of this technology, and then it's just, you know, what the actual feature is or what the initiative is. We as sort of UK PLC really need to support this technology, whether that is supporting you know, vehicle platform manufacturers, whether that is fleet operators and encouraging more fleet operators, or encouraging sort of people to use passenger services rather than their own private cars. You know, not just because of the previous investment, but also the impact on our roads and the environment and things like that as well. So, you know, any sort of incentive to get people out of their private vehicles and into shared mobility, I think it has got to be a positive thing.
Genovefa, any views?
What I was about to say is that if we approach this question from two ways, so from the user-centric design aspect, which is how to maximize opportunities for people to make use of different ways to experience transport, to experience seamless and positive mobility, then obviously, if this is one of the options that can provide more accessibility, that would be a good idea, because if you diversify the kind of options and accessibility aspects for mobility to people, to all people, to everyone, then obviously that's more equitable. At the same time, though, if that's part of a service, the key question there would be what, in effect, the user would need to give in order to use the service. Because there is always a transaction in one way or another. And given that, if that is completely transparent and consented, then obviously that would be, again, a good idea to mobilize this kind of service, kind of solutions for mobility, including intelligent mobility. So I think there are different ways that you can view this kind of approach to see whether it is viable and whether it will provide the appropriate level of utility and value to the users to engage with it. Now, from my own research and interactions with the public, through public engagement events, when I've been discussing with the public about autonomous systems, self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles, there was always the aspect of familiarity. And when you are using a vehicle to go from point A to point B, it's not just for utilitarian and utility purposes. It's also because of the experience. So there comes the individual differences aspect. So a number of people enjoy driving, enjoy doing it within their own space, within their own vehicle. Other people, they like sharing. So we need to take into account these kind of behavioral differences in people in trying to understand what is the appropriate incentive to capture these groups from the public to use these kind of services.
Different strokes for different folks, in essence. And I hear you, Cormac. OXA is, of course, a world leader in its own right. But just to say, for full disclosure, OXA, Wave, Waymo, and Aurigo are all members of SMMT, and we love all of them, just like we love our kids. And each of them is a global leader in its own right. Just saying. Right. There's a question from Nick Reed, but I don't want us to answer Nick's question because it's a really good segue to the next question that I have for Genovefa. However, I'm going to read out Nick's question, and hopefully we can answer his question while discussing the question I have for you, Genovefa. How do we understand and accommodate the interests of non-users who might encounter a self-driving vehicle? So, for example, vulnerable road users like pedestrians and cyclists. But the question I have for you is something along those lines, but also bringing in the subjects that I said I would return to just now: measurement, as well as multidimensional benchmarking. So how do you measure user acceptance of the technology beyond just traditional ways of measuring? Like, for example, people normally look at the number of users, uptake rates, or perhaps uptake growth over a period of time. But how do we genuinely measure user acceptance? How can we validate that we are actually meeting user needs as intended? And if I may throw in a question that blends Nick's question there just now, not just the user needs, but also the needs and interests of the non-users, such as pedestrians and cyclists.
Yeah, there are a lot of interesting things to say, to highlight in these type of questions. Now, just to take it from the beginning, it was the first part of the question was about the measurement, wasn't it?
Measuring user acceptance.
User acceptance. Now, when we're talking about this type of technologies of high automation that they are deployed outside in the natural ecosystem, there is a lot of complexity which is associated to the learning curve. So in order to understand user acceptance of these technologies, we need to see it holistically and also in a longitudinal manner. So the reason for the importance of longitudinal capture of user acceptance and user experience, obviously, is first of all because we need to capture the individual learning curve that different users have when they're exposed to a completely new technology, even more so when it is complex and quite disruptive in a way, such as self-driving cars. But also we need to take into account the fact that opinions might change, beliefs might change as well. There is a dynamic environment that we are dealing with. And when people, let's think about the scenario. When people, they see a self-driving car outside, they get excited because that's something new. They have not experienced it necessarily before. So it's something completely novel, innovative. So they get excited. That's a positive, an example of positive experience. But then when they hear scenarios or news or things that are happening in association to self-driving cars, that might not be the ideal scenarios, their opinions change. That's natural. That's what we do in our everyday life. It doesn't mean necessarily that when we have a particular opinion about something, we will retain that opinion, because we constantly have new data coming to us. And on the base of this new data, we adjust our opinions. We do our own processing, data processing. For that reason, longitudinal understanding of user acceptance is absolutely critical. If I just go to a public event on this Sunday and I talk about self-driving cars and I demonstrate something, yes, I will get a good understanding of what the particular user group, from the public, indicated at that given moment. But then if I repeat that, and that comes the aspect of repeatability, if I try to repeat this activity in a month's time, let's say 2 months' time, 3 months' time, I might get slightly different perceptions. And that has a knock-on effect on the perceived technology acceptance as well. So the metrics for capturing user acceptance, in this case, they have to be taking into account the temporal aspect, and they have to be repeated consistently. There needs to be some kind of consistency to capture that, to verify that. So that comes, I'm trying to address the second part as well of the question, I believe, which was in regards to
Non-users.
how we validate, but also how we take into account other feedback,
Other road
other
users.
opinions, needs from other stakeholders, even if they're not direct users. So we need to have that kind of repeatability. We need to have that type of iteration, which is captured, is facilitated through user-centered design and design thinking. And we need to rethink. We need to think about measurements that they can stand at a longer term context, not just at an individual, at an instant, at just specific time. So yeah, in terms of the capturing the non-users, again, it's very much about reaching out to them and providing the appropriate platforms to elicit this kind of feedback from non-users of self-driving cars to make sure that we complement the perceptions of as a wider group from the public as possible, because they have their rights, they have their concerns or their needs to understand better the technology, even if they're not direct users, but they might be direct actors that they are impacted by self-driving cars. I mean, again, think about different scenarios, accidents, for example. So when we are designing technologies like this, we really need to take into account all the stakeholders and not just the end users or direct users of the service or system.
Where do you draw the line between what is reasonable and what is just plain protest? So, for example, if there's a particular, I wouldn't single out any particular segment, but let's say one particular one segment of society, or maybe even road users, are deeply against self-driving vehicles, and perhaps claim that it's an inconvenience to share roads with self-driving vehicles, perhaps it's a threat to their safety. Where do you draw the line between what's reasonable concern and what's just deeply entrenched views bordering on perhaps Luddite opinions of not wanting any new technology, particularly those types that are really unknown and a bit scary, sharing the roads with us?
That's a very, very good point that you raised, David. And I think that is a core topic that we are dealing, those of us that are doing research. Drawing the line for this kind of contexts is difficult, and it cannot happen from one day to another. The reason why is because from behavioral research, from a research that I am fully aware of, there is a learning curve for individuals, but also for society collectively. So we need to allow enough time for people to understand better these type of technologies and make, in effect, an informed decision on how they will use it, when. So it doesn't happen from one day to another, and drawing the line is really something that will have to take place after we ourselves, as researchers, as designers of such technologies, we learn as well ourselves what are the consequences, what are the interactions, what is the impact, short-term and long-term, that such design technologies can have, not just to the individuals, but to society as a collective. It will happen. I mean, that drawing a line to differentiate what is just a complaint, because of habits or because of own opinions without substantiated data. Yes, it's something we need to take our time and see, but it will happen. It will happen in the future, but I think now it's too early to say that we are able to draw a line on and confidently say that we understand who are the people that they are just complaining for the sake of complaining, and those that they are actually draw and communicate substantial and substantiated concerns. So it's quite difficult to do it now.
I understand. I understand. It's a complex issue. Well, let's draw the line there for a minute, and let's go back to basically just the users of the technology, regardless of who the users are, whether they are the end users or perhaps your immediate customers. And I'm going to pose this to Camilla. In using any new technology, risks are not wholly absent. There will, of course, be a degree of risks, and sometimes it's a question of how we manage risks properly, right? So, how do you suggest we should engage users in the whole user journey to encourage acceptance? So in other words, how do we encourage the users pre and post use, not just merely during the use stage of the journey, and so that people understand the risks that are involved, they're comfortable with the residual risks, assuming that some of the more major ones are already eliminated or mitigated?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting question. One of the pieces of research I'm sort of quite familiar with is around public perception of risk, and how the public perception of risk often doesn't reflect sort of the statistics that back up probability. And, that's quite an interesting thing. So where you have a lot of fear around a risk, or there's new technology, or it's relatively unknown, then people will rank that as a higher level of risk than something that maybe is much more like to kill you. So, a shark attack often gets ranked higher than heart disease. Nuclear sort of accident is often higher than driving. So there's a lot of lack of knowledge and fear and catastrophe that then creates sort of a higher perceived level of risk. And I think, I quite often think back to when, this is a long time ago, David, don't get me wrong, but when I was a teenager, and at that point I had a telephone that was plugged into the wall that I was allowed to use after 6 o'clock. And if I dialed 123, then I got a talking clock and it would tell me what the time was. And that was, pretty high tech at the time. I also, when I started to drive, I got given an AA roadmap. And if I needed to understand something for my homework, we had Britannica encyclopedias and I could go and look stuff up. Now, if at that point I'd been handed an iPhone 16 that was all singing and dancing, and I could phone and I could text and I could Google and I could have sat nav and all that kind of stuff, I wouldn't have known what to do with it. I wouldn't have trusted it, and I certainly wouldn't have made full use of what it can do. But the reason that I now can use an iPhone 16 is because I've gone through the process. And I've had a Nokia. I've learned how to text in the early 2000s. I've learned how to Google. I've seen the disasters of minidisc, but I've lived that journey. I've gone through the process, and now I am where I am. And that's what we need to be doing with our customers, and that's what we need to be doing with our end users, is taking them along that journey with us. There's no point, I think, in waiting until UK regulation comes out in 2028, and then everybody's got, a fully working, autonomous vehicle that can go on road, and we've got hundreds out there. I think if we can start seeing driverless technology as soon as we possibly can, out on the roads, in workplaces, people can interact, people can engage with this technology, build up that trust, understand, the capabilities, but also the limitations. Live and breathe the mini disc experiences with us. Show, the improvements, the iterations, how this technology develops to meet their needs, to meet society needs, and to minimize the risk, not on public roads, on public roads, but also on off-highway environments. I think there'd be a much higher level of acceptance. So that's really what we're trying to do, is exposure, understanding in simple terms, experience, and seeing the improvements as we go.
You mentioned a very good analogy, certainly one that's interesting to me, and we probably grew up in the same era, because I can identify all those things that you mentioned just now, including a phone that is on the wall. and using brick-like Nokias in the early days of cellular technology. Can I ask you, therefore, do you think for digital natives, and assuming we are not digital natives because we grew up in an analog world and then we moved on to the digital world and we've learned all those things that you mentioned, and therefore we can accept an iPhone 16, we can accept self-driving technology, but for digital natives who grew up with technology, grew up in a digital world, do you think they perceive risk differently? And for them, perhaps they are more accepting of new technologies, including self-driving vehicles?
Yeah, I think that there is a general higher acceptance of all of this. You know, I've got two children. They're not children. They're 22 and 18. And I have effectively turned into my mother, asking for support on how to use the latest tech and upload things and, you know, all of this jazz. But they don't even question it. They don't question the security of a device, or if something's not working. And we had a outage as a result of Bert, not even for a few hours, but 48 hours of no internet. And you'd have thought that their right arm had been cut off. You know, this is something that is part of their life, has always been part of their life. It's accepted and it's not questioned. And you know, getting on passenger transport that is automated will be as commonplace for them, you know, as using an iPhone, or you know, looking on Google every time they don't know the answer for something.
Indeed, indeed. I just noticed there's a question from the audience for Genovefa. It's from Maddie Halliwell of CCAF. I'm inclined to suggest that you might want to perhaps contact Maddie, just because Maddie is asking whether you know of any longitudinal attitudes work. So if you're going to cite any scholarly research that actually has been done in this area, probably easier to send by email than to rattle them off one by one.
Hi, Maddie. Yes, let's be in touch. I will drop an email, Maddie.
Good. Excellent. I don't think there are any burning questions left in the chat panel, as well, at least not that I could see. We've got about 3 minutes, or 2 or 3 minutes left, and perhaps let's wrap up. Now, it's only fitting if we probably end by bringing in the role of PAVE UK, whose webinar we are currently on. And of course, PAVE UK was set up earlier this year for a very important purpose, and that's to educate the public and stakeholders on self-driving vehicles, build that awareness, deliver education, and inform people. So can I ask our panelists here, do you see a very specific role for PAVE UK in actually helping users to better understand the technology in the same way as designers ought to put users at the heart of designing CAM technology? So it's a bit like a two-way thing. We put users at the heart of designing the technology. So it's designed for users, but at the same time, we need to bring users along, you know, in this journey, as you said just now, Camilla. So any particular view on the role of PAVE UK specifically? Either of you.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I can see.
Okay. Camilla, you go first.
Yeah, I can see a very important role for PAVE UK, not just within sort of the new generation coming through, you know, although that's very important. I think there is a general acceptance of the new generation and, you know, technology, but actually businesses. You know, how can technology improve their businesses? How can we take HSE, high-risk environments like waste and recycling, quarries? How can we educate people and raise the awareness of automating functions within those industries to be able to reduce risk, reduce deaths within the workplace as well as on public roads? So I think PAVE's got a really strong reputation globally, and being able to increase its reach within the UK feels really key.
That's brilliant. Genovefa, 20 seconds, if I may.
Yeah, and I think that I totally agree with what Camilla said, but also, initiatives like webinars like today, it's part of this kind of knowledge exchange and contributing to this aspect of understanding better this kind of technology. So we need more interactions, and I'm not referring just to human-computer interactions here.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Camilla. Thank you, Genovefa. We've come to the end of the hour. Time flies when you're having fun. Certainly the hour has passed very quickly. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been the PAVE UK webinar on putting users at the heart of CAM technology design. So that's all from us for this time. And until the next PAVE UK webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, David.
Thank you. Thank you all.